Last week, I was looking at photographs of suburban streets in Australia. Perfect lawns, cars parked neatly in driveways, children's bicycles abandoned on footpaths like nothing in the world could go wrong. Everything looked stable, ordinary, safe. Then I opened the mortgage stress data for those exact postcodes, and my hands went cold. Behind every third door, someone is drowning. This is not a future prediction. It's already happening. Quietly. Invisibly. While the headlines tell you the economy is resilient, the numbers are doing something very different. They're counting down. Over the last month, I've analyzed housing stress, employment exposure, industry concentration, and debt levels across Australia. I overlaid unemployment risk with mortgage vulnerability. I tracked which cities are most exposed when consumer spending collapses. I looked for places where a single shock could trigger cascading failure. What emerged was disturbing. 10 Australian cities are standing on the brink of economic collapse. Not collapse as in apocalypse. Not ghost towns overnight. That's not how modern downturns work. This is slower. More cruel. Job losses that ripple through families. Housing price falls that erase decades of savings. Main streets hollowed out as businesses quietly shut their doors. Population decline that changes a city permanently. And the scariest part? Most people living in these cities have no idea how exposed they are. The Reserve Bank of Australia lifted interest rates from 0.1% to 4.35% in under 2 years, the fastest hiking cycle in Australian history. Borrowing costs didn't just rise. They snapped back to reality. But the damage wasn't caused by rate hikes alone. It was locked in years earlier, when households borrowed amounts that only made sense if money stayed cheap forever. When banks approved loans assuming stability was guaranteed. When an entire system bet on the idea that nothing would go wrong. Australia technically avoided recession through 2024, on paper. But per person, the economy shrank. A per capita recession. People got poorer while the headline said everything was fine. That's not resilience. That's camouflage. And the pain is not evenly distributed. Cities like Sydney and Melbourne have deep, diversified economies. They have options, buffers, multiple industries to fall back on. The cities we're about to examine don't. They're built on narrow foundations: tourism, mining, single employers, fragile housing booms, or shrinking industries. When conditions turn, there's nowhere to hide. This documentary isn't opinion. It's data. Cold, unforgiving data that points to specific places where the next downturn will hit hardest and first. These cities are the canaries in the coal mine. When the economic tide goes out, we're about to see exactly who's been swimming without their clothes on. Number 10, Cairns, the tourism illusion. Cairns is beautiful, that's its problem. With around 170,000 residents, Cairns is built almost entirely around tourism. The Great Barrier Reef, tropical beaches, international visitors. On paper, it looks like a permanent advantage. In reality, it's a single point of failure. More than 60% of the local economy depends directly or indirectly on tourism. Hotels, restaurants, tour operators, dive companies, transport, retail. Almost every paycheck traces back to visitors spending discretionary money. And discretionary spending is the first thing to disappear in a recession. When economic fear hits, families cancel holidays immediately. International tourists choose cheaper destinations. Domestic travel collapses. There is no gradual slowdown. Visitor numbers fall off a cliff. Cairns already runs unemployment higher than the national average, often between 5% and 7% even in good times. A large share of workers are casual or part-time, with no redundancy, no notice, and no savings buffer. When shifts disappear, income goes to zero overnight. During the pandemic boom, housing prices surged as city buyers chased lifestyle moves. But those price rises had nothing to do with local wages. They were driven by outsiders. Now that demand is gone, that leaves a housing market priced for Sydney incomes, supported by Cairns jobs. That mismatch is dangerous. When tourism slows and unemployment rises, forced sales follow quickly. Cairns doesn't get hit in stages. It gets hit everywhere at once. Number 9. Townsville, structural weakness. If Cairns is fragile because it relies on one industry, Townsville is fragile because it never fully healed. Home to about 180,000 people. Townsville has one of the highest long-term unemployment rates of any major Australian city, often sitting between 6% and 8%. That's not a temporary issue. It's structural. Youth unemployment is particularly severe. Young people grow up here, get educated, then leave, because there are limited career paths. That drains the city of skills, ambition, and long-term economic momentum. Townsville's economy leans heavily on defense, mining services, and port operations. Defense provides some stability. Mining services do not. They rise and fall with global commodity prices, which can collapse without warning. When mining companies cut exploration or delay projects, service jobs disappear immediately. And Townsville lacks alternative industries to absorb those workers. Housing is another weak point. The city has a history of apartment oversupply and fragile demand. Prices are supported by confidence, not strong population growth. When unemployment rises, buyer demand vanishes fast. And when times get tough, people leave and don't rush back. That population leakage creates a downward spiral. Fewer people, less investment, fewer jobs, weaker housing demand. Each downturn makes the next one worse. Why these two matter? Cairns and Townsville share a dangerous trait. They enter recession already vulnerable. One depends on tourism. The other on cyclical industries and weak demographics. When the economy turns, they won't just slow down. They'll fracture. And they're only the beginning. Number 8. Darwin. Built to break. Darwin has lived through multiple economic collapses, and the pattern never changes. With around 150,000 residents, Australia's most remote capital city is tied almost entirely to defense, resources, and major construction projects. When those projects are active, wages soar and housing booms. When they finish, workers leave almost overnight. The last major resources boom from 2010 to 2014 pushed median house prices to around $650,000. Liquefied natural gas projects brought in thousands of fly-in workers. Money flooded the city. Then the projects ended. Prices crashed into the $450,000 range. That's a 30% fall, enough to wipe out years of equity and trap buyers in negative territory. Some simply walked away, mailing their keys back to the bank. Darwin's biggest weakness is geography. There is nowhere else to go nearby. No commuter belt, no adjacent city to absorb displaced workers. When employment disappears, people leave the city entirely. That leads to real population decline. Not slower growth, but net exodus. Housing demand collapses. Businesses shut. Services shrink. The downward spiral feeds on itself. This time, the risk is even greater. Interest rates are far higher than during previous busts. Holding costs are heavier. Mortgage buffers are thinner. Owners have far less ability to ride out another collapse. Darwin doesn't just slow in recessions. It empties. Number 7. Hobart, the price-income time bomb. Hobart tells a different but equally dangerous story. Between 2016 and 2021, Hobart experienced one of the most extreme housing booms in Australian history. Prices surged 80 to 90% in just 5 years, rising from around $350,000 to more than $650,000. But wages never followed. Tasmania has some of the lowest median incomes in the country. The boom wasn't driven by local earning power. It was driven by interstate buyers, investors, and pandemic-driven relocations. That creates a structural imbalance. Many homeowners locked in low fixed rates during the boom. As those expire, mortgage repayments are jumping by $500 to $1,000 a month. For households already stretched, that increase is devastating. Hobart's economy is narrow. Tourism, government services, education, and healthcare. These provide stability, but not growth. When recession hits, job losses in tourism and retail will push mortgage stress into forced sales. For those who bought near the peak, even modest price declines could push them into negative equity. That's when selling becomes a trap instead of an escape. Unlike Sydney or Melbourne, Hobart lacks the economic gravity to absorb shocks quickly. Population growth is limited. Employment options are narrow. Recovery is slow. Number 6, Geelong, the incomplete transition. Geelong is a city in transition, and that's precisely the problem. Home to roughly 280,000 people. Geelong spent decades anchored to manufacturing. When that anchor snapped, the city never fully replaced it. The closure of Ford's plant in 2016 eliminated around 600 direct jobs. Earlier, Alcoa's smelter shutdown dealt another major blow. The supply chains, skills, and secondary businesses that depended on those employers never fully recovered. Geelong has tried to reinvent itself. Healthcare, education, port operations, and public services now play a larger role. Deakin University brought students and jobs. Waterfront redevelopment improved lifestyle appeal. But economic transitions take time, and recessions don't wait. During the pandemic boom, Geelong benefited massively from its proximity to Melbourne. As Melbourne buyers searched for space and affordability, Geelong prices surged. Housing growth wasn't driven by local wage growth. It was driven by external demand. That creates a dangerous dependency. When Melbourne slows, Geelong feels it immediately. Fewer buyers, less equity spillover, reduced commuter confidence. At the same time, a recession would hit Geelong's local job market. Construction, retail, hospitality, hard. That's the double hit. Reduced demand from Melbourne and rising local unemployment. Housing markets that grow as satellite alternatives tend to fall faster when the core weakens. Owners who bought at peak prices expecting continued spillover demand may discover there are fewer buyers and more sellers than anticipated. Geelong doesn't collapse on its own. It catches pneumonia when Melbourne sneezes. Number 5. Gold Coast, big city, fragile core. With nearly 680,000 residents, the Gold Coast is Australia's 6th largest city. Size, however, does not equal stability. The Gold Coast economy is built on sectors that vanish when confidence disappears. Tourism, construction, retail, hospitality, and entertainment. These are discretionary industries. They thrive when people feel wealthy and collapse when they don't. Theme parks, hotels, resorts, nightlife venues, shopping precincts. Thousands of jobs depend on visitors spending freely. When recession hits, those visitors disappear fast. The workforce here is also uniquely exposed. A high proportion of jobs are casual or contract-based. That means job losses are immediate, not gradual. Shifts vanish. Hours are cut. Income drops without warning. Housing makes the risk worse. The Gold Coast experienced a massive high-rise apartment boom. Investors poured in. Supply surged. Many properties were bought on thin margins, relying on rental income and capital growth. In a downturn, this becomes explosive. Tourism declines. Short-term rentals collapse. Job losses rise. Tenants can't pay. Investors sell. Prices fall. Confidence breaks. Buyers vanish. Construction is another pressure point. When demand slows, projects are cancelled or delayed. That wipes out jobs instantly, hitting trades, suppliers, and service businesses all at once. The Gold Coast looks like a diversified metropolis. In reality, it's a highly leveraged leisure economy. When recession hits, it doesn't bend. It sheds jobs, listings, and confidence simultaneously. Geelong and the Gold Coast are different in size, but identical in vulnerability. One depends on Melbourne's health. The other depends on consumer confidence. Both expanded rapidly during boom conditions that no longer exist. And when momentum turns into retreat, these cities feel it faster than most. Number 4. Launceston, the scale problem. With a population of just over 110,000, Launceston's biggest weakness is size. Small cities can thrive in stable times. But when recession hits, scale becomes a liability. Launceston's economy is built around a narrow mix of agriculture, healthcare, tourism, and remnants of manufacturing. There is no deep private sector employment base. No major growth industry waiting in the wings. Unemployment here has historically sat above the national average. Wages are lower. Career progression is limited. When jobs disappear, workers don't move sideways. They leave. That's where the real risk lies. During the recent housing boom, Launceston saw significant price growth, driven largely by interstate buyers chasing affordability. But local incomes never supported those prices. The gap between earning capacity and housing costs quietly widened. In a recession, that gap snaps shut. Mortgage stress rises quickly. Forced sales increase. And because demand is thin to begin with, prices can fall sharply with relatively few transactions. Small markets don't need many sellers to move prices down dramatically. Population decline is the final blow. When young people and skilled workers leave, demand for housing and services falls further. Businesses close. Services shrink. The city enters a downward spiral that's difficult to reverse. Launceston doesn't need a major shock to break. It only needs a moderate one. Number 3. Wollongong, the single industry risk. Wollongong is bigger. around 300,000 people, but its vulnerability is more concentrated. The city remains heavily tied to one employer and one industry, steel. The BlueScope steel operations at Port Kembla are not just another employer. They are the economic backbone of the region. When steel production is strong, Wollongong feels stable. When it weakens, the impact ripples instantly through contractors, transport, suppliers, and local businesses. Steel manufacturing is brutally cyclical. Global demand drops in recessions. Competition from cheaper overseas producers intensifies. Margins compress. Production is cut. Employment follows. Wollongong has tried to diversify. Education, healthcare, and lifestyle migration from Sydney have helped, but the dependence hasn't disappeared. Housing adds another layer of exposure. As Sydney prices exploded, Wollongong became a spillover market. Buyers priced out of Sydney pushed values higher, often well beyond what local wages could sustain. That growth was externally driven, not earned locally. When Sydney slows, that demand evaporates. If a recession coincides with production cuts at Port Kembla, Wollongong faces a double shock: rising unemployment and falling buyer demand. That combination is toxic for housing markets. Prices don't drift down, they gap lower. And because so much local confidence is tied to a single employer, sentiment can turn quickly. Once it does, selling accelerates. Launceston and Wollongong highlight a critical truth. Economic diversity isn't a luxury. It's survival infrastructure. One city is too small to absorb shock. The other is too dependent to deflect it. When recession arrives, these cities won't have time to adapt. They'll react, fast, visibly, and painfully. Number 2. Newcastle, the coal clock is ticking. Newcastle is home to around 320,000 people and has spent decades trying to escape the shadow of a single industry: coal. The Port of Newcastle is the largest coal export port in the world. For years, that meant jobs, revenue, and confidence. Today, it represents long-term risk. Coal faces structural decline. The global energy transition, changing demand, and political pressure mean the industry's future is shrinking, not expanding. A recession accelerates that process brutally. When global demand drops, coal prices fall. Mines scale back, contractors are cut, logistics slows. Newcastle has seen this movie before. The closure of the BHP Steelworks in 1999 wiped out thousands of jobs and hollowed out the local economy. Recovery took decades. The city has diversified since toward education, healthcare, and renewable energy. But those sectors are still too small to fully replace coal's economic weight. Housing adds another layer of fragility. As Sydney became unaffordable, Newcastle transformed into a satellite market. Prices surged on the back of Sydney equity, not local income growth. That makes demand highly sensitive to conditions outside the city. When recession hits, Newcastle faces pressure from 3 directions at once: falling coal demand, slowing construction and logistics, reduced buyer demand from Sydney. That convergence is dangerous. It doesn't take a collapse in all 3. Just weakness in 2 is enough to tip the balance. Newcastle isn't on the edge because it's failing today. It's on the edge because its past and future are pulling in opposite directions, right as the economy weakens. Number 1. Adelaide, the quiet giant at risk. Adelaide tops this list not because it's small or chaotic, but because it looks deceptively stable. With 1.4 million residents, Adelaide is Australia's 5th largest city. It has more economic diversity than most of the cities we've covered. Defense, education, healthcare, wine, and government services all provide ballast. But Adelaide carries deep structural scars. The end of automotive manufacturing. Mitsubishi in 2008, Holden in 2017, removed tens of thousands of direct and indirect jobs. Those were middle-income, stable roles that supported entire communities. They never came back. Historically, South Australia runs unemployment 0.5 to 1.5 percentage points above the national average. Growth has lagged the eastern capitals for decades. Population inflows are weaker. Private investment is thinner. During the housing boom, Adelaide saw strong price growth, but without the international migration and investor depth that supports Sydney or Melbourne. That makes its housing market more exposed in downturns. In a recession, Adelaide faces a familiar problem: slower recovery. When unemployment rises here, it tends to rise faster and fall slower. Fewer alternative industries mean displaced workers struggle to find new roles. Confidence erodes quietly but persistently. Adelaide doesn't collapse loudly. It stalls. And stalls are dangerous because they drain momentum year after year. Businesses delay hiring. Young people leave. Housing demand softens. Prices fall, not sharply, but steadily. That kind of decline is harder to reverse than a sudden shock. These 10 cities, Cairns, Townsville, Darwin, Hobart, Geelong, Gold Coast, Launceston, Wollongong, Newcastle, and Adelaide, share one thing. They have less margin for error than most Australians realize. When recession flows through the economy, it hits in stages. Interest rate stress, job losses, forced sales, business closures, population movement. In these cities, those stages compress. Awareness is not panic. Preparation is not pessimism. Location matters in downturns. Industry exposure matters. Housing fundamentals matter. Because when the economy turns, it doesn't hit everywhere equally. And these cities will feel it first.